Hi, everybody. I'm John. I am both the head of strategy at itslearning and also a privacy champion in itslearning.
Hi, and I'm Stephen Threadgold. I'm a global product manager, and I'll be talking a little bit about the way you can use the data that's within itslearning, but we'll start off with John gives an overview about what that data is and how we keep it secure.
Great, thank you, Stephen. So we're going to talk a little bit about data protection and combined with security and what is important to think about, particularly in these days with a lot of schools doing more blended learning or going full virtual during the epidemic. And I want to start off by saying that what's really important to remember that data protection is really a shared responsibility. It's a shared responsibility between the institutions that use itslearning and the institutions that you work for, and between them and us in itslearning. On one hand, you cannot protect your students alone. You rely a lot on your vendors like itslearning. On the other hand, we as a vendor, we can do a lot to protect the system itself, keeping it safe. But it's only as safe as we manage to make it on our own. And then it's only also as compliant as we can make it on our own. So each on our own, we cannot make the use of itslearning GDPR compliant, but together we do. So that's important to keep in mind. So whoever you're listening, whether you're a teacher or a school administrator, to really understand how to protect your students' data, you first need to really think about one important thing. And that is the fact that what data protection means and what GDPR does is saying that students or people's data, really people's personal data, is something that you can process, but you can only process it if you actually respect the rights of the data subjects, of the end users. So for instance, if you want to take a piece of data about the student, like in this case, there's a young boy on the screen, to in any way process or use their data for any purpose, you really need to understand what it means, because you might be violating on some fundamental rights of that person if you don't do it properly. So this is really about the rights of your students. And to be able to process somebody's personal data in a lawful manner, you have to make sure that there is a purpose for it. And in an education context, whether it's in higher ed or in schools, the purpose is often quite clear. You know, you're dealing with education. So there is a purpose related to actually maybe giving assignments or doing virtual learning or doing blended learning. But this needs to be specified. It needs to be something that is not only kind of inherent, you know, implicit in what you're doing, but it needs to be explicitly stated. And that's information that actually needs to be available to your students or their parents or guardians. What's also important is that this kind of data can't then be used for other purposes. You can't say, have a purpose for using itslearning to say, you know, when you want to administer homework, and then suddenly going off and using the same student data for a whole different purpose. That's not how. That's actually a restriction in GDPR. So the purpose we define, the purpose that's set for using a student's personal data must actually be what it's going to be used for. Then it's, of course, also necessary to ensure appropriate technical and organizational security. And this is another matter I will talk a little bit on some later slides. But what it really means is that the type of data you receive and process, you know, how vulnerable that is needs to be considered against how much security you need to have in place. And we know from the data protection authorities in Europe, from assessments and verdicts and fines that's been given, that large volume of student data, and students, or particularly pupils that are younger, who might not have much say in how their data is processed, that's data that is considered quite not sensitive but vulnerable data. So it's really important to make sure that the security, and not just technical security like firewalls or virus protection, but organizational security, meaning the competence of the people involved, or routines for adding or deleting stuff, that has to be really a fairly high standard to be allowed to process it. Another very important point is transparency, right? When you process students' data, it has to be really transparent. For older students, higher ed, the transparency should first and foremost be directed towards them. But then for younger kids, it also has to be directed from the parents. There should never be any challenge or issue for anybody to actually figure out, I wonder what my data is being used for. That should be totally transparent. It has to be totally transparent. And then again, of course, when data is no longer needed for the purpose that has been specified, it should be deleted. And I think that's something a lot of schools know about, but it's also something that we particularly have to consider when we're using these days a lot of ad hoc systems to get the school working during a pandemic. This data also then needs to be deleted after it's served its purposes in these different systems. Then, of course, finally, we also have to remember that if there is such thing as a data breach, students have a right to know about it. And they have a right to know about it very quickly, within 72 hours. So these are really, if you want to understand how to protect data, start with the rights of the end users. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what itslearning does, right, to protect data. Our role is in ensuring GDPR compliance. It's about a lot of things, but the primary thing we need to make sure is that we provide appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect the data you put into the itslearning platform. And our security measures, they're a mix of many things. It could be anything from how we train our staff, what kind of management processes we have, how we design our system. And a lot of our security measures are embedded in something we call an information security management system. So this is a system that is quite well known in the technology industry, and ours is certified by something that is called ISO 27001, which is a standard that is audited, where somebody comes to our office and audits us every year to make sure we have good systems for retaining security. We also work on the product development side a lot with what we call privacy by design, security by design, to make sure that our product, that we don't suddenly release something that might pose a risk to students or to you as a teacher or as a school leader or as an institution. Examples of such privacy by design and default is, for instance, you will sometimes see in itslearning when we release something new. This is our new tool for individual learning plans, where we carefully are providing information to guide teachers in making sure they don't, for instance, put in sensitive data. It could be other things too, like improving integration with third-party apps. We will remind you, make sure you have a valid agreement with this vendor before you add it to itslearning. We also, of course, provide tools in itslearning to help you adhere to multiple rights of the users. And in this case, this example, for instance, we talk a lot about how you can create data, how you can restrict data, and how you can delete data. And also we have a tool that allows you to export all the information on an individual student or teacher from the system, should they request so. This is an important right under GDPR, and it's something that happens not very often, but it happens a few times every year that we help customers do these kind of exports. We also work a lot with making sure that what's called sub-processors, it's other vendors we use to provide itslearning. You know, itslearning is not an island, not all the technology that goes into itslearning is created by us. We rely on other vendors for hosting. We rely on other vendors, for instance, for, as Lars talked about earlier, Microsoft for this for some of the new tools we have released. In those cases, we have very rigid processes to make sure we sign agreements with them that are GDPR compliant and compliant with the contracts we have with US customers, and we audit their security and everything. And we keep doing that every year to make sure we try to stay compliant, and of course that these vendors help us protect student data. Most things, last thing I would like to say is that from experience now, you know, we're a couple of years into working with data protection, and we see data protection authorities putting their fingers on some specific things among schools and educational institutions. There is just a very few things that, or not a very few things, but there's a few commonalities amongst a lot of the, shall we say, kind of gaps that often are pointed out between how schools use educational technology and how they should be using it from a kind of a data protection authority point of view. And the number one must be authentication, right? In today's world, with so much student data being available in platforms such as itslearning and similar, lack of adequate authentication is a challenge. And actually some municipalities and institutions have been fined for not having adequate authentication, or it has at least played into the size of the fines in some cases. Making sure, particularly if you work on the IT side, you know, making sure that we have strong authentication, for instance, two-factor authentication, those kind of things turned on for staff. That is very important. Well, the point is often lack of data minimization, meaning that maybe there is just a bit too much data put into a system that's not really needed there. Do you need that home address to be in itslearning? Of course, if it serves a purpose, it can be there, but if it doesn't really serve a purpose, it shouldn't be there. Also, training your staff, your school, teachers, understanding the security measures that the institution has in place, the procedures they have in place. That's also one common issue we see often in such instances where there is an audit happening. Lack of transparency, meaning it's not clear what's actually happening with the data processing. And then something that's called a DPIA, lack of a DPIA. DPIA is like a risk assessment, data protection impact assessment, and it's something that often should be used when you acquire, particularly when you start using new technologies. Another one is special categories of personal data, health data, those kind of data should not really go into a system that is focused on the educational aspects, because that's not really a good reason for keeping health data, and it's actually not allowed under GDPR. And then, of course, making sure we have control, or customers must have control if there is a data breach. You know, how do we actually notify the people that have been affected of these things? So that was my introduction to data protection. I'll be around again for the Q&A later, but now we are going to pass this one on to Stephen, I believe. There we go. Oh.
Great, thank you, John. I hope everybody can see my screen. Is that you can should see the title? That's great. So what I'm going to try and do is put a little bit of context around some of the things that John has been talking about. I'm going to show some of the reports that we have for teachers and the sort of questions that teachers can answer about where their students are in terms of progression, in terms of grade, in terms of activity within the platform. And one of the reasons these two things go together is you can also see what sort of information we are keeping, because if we keep a piece of information within this learning, as John was saying, there must be a purpose for it. So when I show you the reports that teachers have access to, you are seeing virtually all of the data that we have on students. We're not storing information and not using it. Any information that we're storing has a valid purpose. And there's one or two bits of very sensitive information that we work with our customers to determine if they want us to store them or not. And I'll talk about those as we go through. I think for us, one of the most important things about data and understanding how people want to use data is the way that teachers' attitudes have changed over time. About 8 years ago, there was a very famous piece of work done called Teachers Know Best. It was one of the first things that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation did after Bill Gates left Microsoft. It was something he was really passionate about, how to use data to improve teachers' lives. And what they did is they went out and talked to literally thousands of teachers to say, what sort of data are you interested in? What sort of data do you want to see? And how can it help you? And then we can fast forward a few years and talk about what data is important now. So going back to sort of 8 years ago and the Teacher Knows Best paper, one of the things that they said is they really wanted teachers to be able to assess data themselves, analyze data themselves, and what we call pivot instruction, which means I see something, I understand what's gone on, and I change what I'm doing. That's what we mean by pivoting instruction. Then we try and simplify data, to find good ways to display it and show it. And then we also want to empower students. If we fast forward to a piece of work done by the Data Quality Campaign just a year or so ago, we can see that now the focus is really about not just analyzing and assessing data, but for that information to inform me, tell me which students need more help. And we can do that in many different ways. For instance, if a student is not reading the course materials, not submitting assignments or submitting assignments that are late, or they're not engaged with the course, they're not asking questions, they're not, for instance, going into the discussion groups and adding items, then that can help me, highlight, or it can highlight to me that that student may need more help. We also want to identify trends. So if I know what's happening this week, I know what's happening last week, I know what's happening the week before, can the system predict those trends moving forward? And at the moment, we tend to use those in grades to give grade trends. Also, now we've got this lovely information, we've got this really rich information sitting underneath my courses. How can I use it as a teacher to understand the efficacy of my delivery and the content in my course? Are students looking at it? Are students benefit from it? Are students rereading it? Because if I have something that the student reads not once, but twice, 3 times, 4 times, it might be they don't understand it, but it also might be it's a really useful resource for them. And if I've spent a lot of time creating a resource that no student looks at, that the students don't really get to within the course, then that's something for me to think about. Was it a good use of my time? Can I improve that content? So at the heart of everything I'm going to talk about, it's how do you want to use the data to tailor instruction? How can we see what's going on and help our students? Because that's what teaching and learning is all about for teachers. How can we help our students? I'm going to talk a lot about the 360 reports. These are standard reports that every course has. We have a very small number of customers that have actually turned them off because they don't want them to be used by their teachers for whatever reason. But most of our users, 99%, have access to these in all of their courses. And each of these provides teachers insight into different features. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the sort of questions that you can answer and then show the course and show some details and examples. So when we look at something like the activity report, which is the first of the 360 reports I see, the sort of questions that we can answer using this report are, are my students engaged? So in other words, are they logging in? Are they logging in regularly? Are they spending time in the course? Are they involved in what's going on in the course? So are they looking at course materials? Are they commenting in the discussion groups that I've set up? Are they sending me emails from the course, using the instant messenger tool, to communicate with me? And also we provide a really simple view of is engagement going up or down over time. So what I've got here is I've got how well students are engaged with the course itself through itslearning. Now, of course, they may be coming to the courses, they may be sat in the classroom, but during these times of COVID, where so much learning is being done, often, completely online, it's really important to have a flavor of this. So these are the questions that we can answer, and we do this by showing how often the student is visiting the course. You can see here that we have this week activity. So that tells me, is this week's activity up on last week's? So if I engage with one of my students and say, you need to spend more time on the course, you need to be looking at materials, and they say, I'll make a big effort this week, you can look at their 360 report and see if they did spend more time within the course. I can see a heat map that shows for that student how often they're visiting the course and when. So for instance, I'd expect them maybe not to be visiting at weekends, not to be visiting during the holidays, but I'd want to see them, engaged during my normal lesson periods. It'll also be interesting, are they only going into the course on the day that they have my class? So if I'm teaching maths twice a week and the student heat map shows that they're only logging on twice a week, that might be because they're only logging on when I'm setting them something within the course. So I get a flavor for how people are engaging with the course. Okay. And then I can see the communication, the threads and the discussion groups, and then also, when people are visiting, that sort of information. So this, if you like, is the bread and butter. This is the simplest information that we can show, and it's really trying to give you an idea of how people are engaged with the course. It's also worth pointing out, as I jump onto the next page, you can see at the top, I can export this information to Excel, and I can scroll up and down across everybody in my course, so I can see at a glance who's engaged, who isn't engaged. So for instance, when I look at the activity, the progress part of this, I can see that John has not looked at any of the resources, and I can scroll up and down and see easily that most of the students have gone through about a third, between 30 and 40% of the resources I've set. So it might be that John is not engaged with the course, it might be he's been off ill, but I can see at a glance whether I need to jump in and have a look in more detail at what John's been doing. So when we talk about our progress and how students are progressing through the course, the sort of questions that we want to answer here are, how many of the course assessments have the students completed? How many of the resources have they looked at? Which of the resources has a particular student seen? So for instance, it might be that Sally has looked at some of the resources, but not the ones I think are most important. And also we provide something called a student submission profile. And this is where we use the information that we store as part of the assessment process to see whether students submitted their assessments on time. Did they hand them in past the deadline? Did they hand them in before the deadline? Or did they not hand them in at all? And this is an example of where we're using that simple data that we're storing because it's needed for assessment. You need to know when students handed in the work, and we're showing that to teachers so they can get some value from it. So those are the important questions that I'm asking here. And if we have a look at the page beneath, I can easily see at a glance how often the student is submitting things on time, how often they're completing things at a past deadline, and how many times they've missed an assessment. I can also see how many of the resources they visited, which gives me an idea about how many of the items in the course they've looked at. And I can also see how many they've not visited. And because some items can be hidden from students, I can have some students, for instance, looking at advanced material before the rest of the class do, if I thought that was a good idea. I also show the number of items that are not active, so we don't want to count those at this particular time. You'll also see an idea about how long the student's spending within the course. You can see on this page, I can see time online. Time online is a really interesting statistic. It's one of the things that we know teachers get value from to understand how long a student is spending. It has lots of caveats around it, And I mentioned at the top of this meeting, there was one piece of information that we can choose to never record, and that's time online. It's one of the things that we sit down with the customers when they start using itslearning, and if they are concerned about monitoring time online, we can actually deactivate that. John was talking about only storing data when there's a purpose for it. We think it's a great thing to store. We think it's really helpful in showing how often and how long students are spending within the course and how long they're spending within itslearning. But you can choose to have that as a customer, you can choose to have that deactivated. And that's because following GDPR, we only want to show the things that we have explained in our data processing agreements and everybody thinks is a useful use. So we're not storing things like, age and height and those sort of things, to do with students. We're storing the things that are important for teaching and learning. And time online is one of the ones that, some schools, not many, it's a tiny percentage, think this is not useful to know. And so it's one of the things that we offer to just not store at all. But you can see it here in the context, you can see why it's useful. So I can see, for instance, that when I look at the two introductions to Shakespeare that I've created to Sally, she's spent 9 minutes looking at one, 18 minutes looking at another. That means I have a pretty good idea she's spent a reasonable amount of time on it. And then as we go through, if I see that she's spent seconds or minutes looking at things, I can think maybe that's not as important to her. So progress is all about showing how far through the course we've got, how well the students are engaging with the materials, and how close to looking at all the materials they are. And because I can hide materials, those will not appear in these totals. So it's just the materials that the student should be looking at. The last of the reports we have in the 360s is really helping teachers understand how well my students are doing in terms of their grades, what we would really call their sort of more formative feedback. I know some of it can be summative, but more formative feedback. And here we're showing the grade trends across the course. So hopefully we want to see them going up. As it happens in this particular course, I can see that my grade trends are trending down a little bit. So it looks like I've had some A's and some B's and maybe some C's. But I can also, again, compare each student. So again, in the view I can see here, Sally hasn't answered any assessments, and that might be cause for concern. It also might be, the date to have the submitted by is next week. Some students have submitted them early. I've already given them feedback and the rest are catching up. That's why that profile was so important. I can look for different grade scales because, of course, we don't want to be comparing grade scales really, because if it's something that's being marked pass fail, you can't really compare that to A, B, C, D, E type grades. So we allow the teachers to filter these so they can just look at the grade scales they're interested in. And with all of these, there's also the ability to filter this view by group as well. So I can see the trends for grades. I can see how students compare to the average. So I can see I've got all my students that have been assessed so far have a B, and the course average is a B. And also I can see which students are higher and lower. Then if I was interested in one of these students, I can click on that and I can see a detailed grade summary. Again, I can choose the term, I can choose the grade scale, and then I can even see how many items have been, completed on time, etc. at the bottom, and how many assignments have been assessed. And this grade trend is really important to see moving forwards. So with these core reports, activity, progress, grades, I as a teacher can get a really strong view of what's going on within my course. I can compare my students, I can filter by group, and I can export any of these snapshots, these high-level snapshots, to Excel. So for instance, next week I'll be going, well, not going into school because we have lockdown here in the UK, so I'll be doing a virtual teachers evening with my for my daughter and talking to her teachers. One of the things it would be great for them to be able to do is to be able to export straight to Excel all of the students in the class and be able to say, well, it looks like this student has got so far through the content. This student, for instance, hasn't been engaging with the content as we'd like. That's the sort of information I want to get back if I was a parent. Okay. So 360 reports available to everybody. 99% of the information that we're storing on students in terms of their progress and courses and so on is being shown through these courses. So the other thing it does is it gives you a really good idea about the sort of data that we are storing. There's lots of other things in the 360s. One of the great things you can do is as you're working through the 360s, if I see students that need help, because we were talking about looking, understanding and pivoting. If I see students that need help, I can select them. So here I've selected Sally and Mark. You know, Sally's got really well through the activities, but maybe I'm just thinking, you know, their resources, they don't seem to have looked through the resources I want. Maybe there's a problem. And then I can send them a message straight from the reports, for instance, saying, you know, have you looked at this? Here's something else you may want to look at, or maybe come and see me and we'll discuss this. So what we want you to be able to do is be in the 360 reports and then instantly be able to take an action on those and, you know, do something proactive. There's no point just looking at the reports and seeing them. You also want to be able to do something proactively. And you can do this straight from the overview. And if you jump in and have a look at the students details page, you can see it in there as well. The other way that we can show this data, as well as showing it in the classroom, we can also show it at the level above that. One of the features that we have in itslearning is the concept of a supervisor or mentor. So this is a member of staff, for instance, a year tutor or a pastoral member of staff who has responsibility for students across courses. Okay? So they're looking not just at Sally within science, if I'm a science teacher, but I'm looking at Sally within all of the courses that she's taking, and she might be taking several courses through her studies this year. And it's not just Sally that I have responsibility for, it's many other students as well. And we call those supervisors and mentors. It's a really simple system to set up. If you're not using it already in your school, talk to your administrator. They can set a supervisor up, and then they can say which students are, you know, which students the mentor has responsibility for. And when that's set up, you can choose to turn on a view of the 360 reports. Because this data is for many courses, for many students, it's something that, you know, the customer has to opt in to have turned on. It is turned on as default for all of our customers at the moment, unless you specifically say it's something that we don't want to see. And the way it works is, as a mentor, I can see all of the students that I have responsibility for, and that might be 100 students or 50 students. You know, it could be quite a large number of students. And then for those students, I can see all the courses they attend, and I've highlighted Sally, and so I can see all of the courses that Sally is attending, and I can see, for instance, that she's been very active in history over the last week, but she hasn't been active in combined science or English. And then, just like the 360 reports, I can move through and see her progress in combined science and all her other subjects and her grades. And here we're comparing Sally's average visit duration with the average for all of the students that I have in those courses. Okay, so I can instantly compare, for instance, Belle, Mark and Helen and Sally by comparing them to the average that they're all spending within that course. So as well as activity, I can look at their progress. So I can see here, for instance, that Sally has got through 100% of the items in history. Okay, but she hasn't really engaged with English. So now I'm getting a more holistic view of Sally's progress and engagement across her courses. And again, I can call Sally in and I can talk to her, or I can have a chat with her English teacher and say, why do you think Sally's not engaged? And I can see her grade progress as well. Okay. So I can see her activity, her grade progress, and her grades across all of her courses. And just like the course reports, if we think about progress, why hasn't Sally really engaged with her subjects? I can jump in and I can take a look at the detailed reports for any of those courses. And then I can jump through each of the different subjects and the people in the subjects. And so I can get a really good view of what's going on. The other view I've got when I hit courses at the top is, rather than seeing my students, I can now see all the courses that my students are attending, and then I can see a view of each course and how all my students are doing in the courses. And again, I can have a look at the activity and I can have a look at the grades. So what it's really giving to me is a holistic view of what's going on across all my students, across all my courses. So that's mentors. So that's the sort of more holistic view. So What about giving students a view of this information? One of the things that the data we looked at, the reports that we looked at right at the top of my session, was saying it's really important for students to understand what's going on within their courses and how they're engaging with the courses and their progress. So one of the things under teacher control, so this can be turned off by teachers at the course level. You can set a default as a customer, as an entire commune or district or local authority. You can set a default. For instance, you want to have this on, or you want to have this off, or you don't want to have it at all. But within each course, and it's turned off as default because we think this is something that teachers know best. They know if their students are able to use this information. It might be for younger students, it's not much use, but for older students, it's really important. You can choose to give students access to the 360 reports for just them. So for instance, they can see how far through the course materials they've got if you give them access to progress. They can see a more detailed view of their grades and their grade trends than they would from the normal assessment report that they see. And you can choose to let them see the activity report, how often they're logging in, so they can see if they're engaging with the course. They can't see any other student, they can't see averages, but they can see how they are engaging with your course, with your materials, and with its learning. And this is something that we find really useful in HE, FE, and for older students, at sort of, secondary school, etc. It's giving them a little bit more ownership. Teachers turn this on, teachers turn this off. It's easy to do. It's literally just opening up the settings for courses, and then there's 3 tick boxes to turn activity, progress, and grades on. And you can, as I said, as a authority and so on, you can choose to have those turned on. Teachers can always choose to turn them off because we think the course teachers know their students best. So that's giving access to the same data for students. Also, if students are saying, well, what data do you have on me? You can show them for a typical course and say, this is the sort of information that we have. Because literally we're seeing nearly all the information that we're storing. And it's information that's important for the success of the student. Are they struggling? And we're interpreting that from, are they looking at materials and how far through they've got them? So storing those 2 bits of information allows us to help say whether we think a student could be struggling or not. One of the other things that we've introduced recently, this came out this year, and in fact, it's recently been activated for most customers. I think nearly all customers have got this now. It's something that we're rolling out quite slowly because it's something we're interested to get feedback on, is making the data in these 360 reports proactive. In other words, rather than you, for instance, going in every day and looking at things, wouldn't it be great to get a weekly summary of what's going on in the course? So following good GDPR practice, we made this opt-in. A teacher has to go into the notification settings in the 360 reports and say, I would like a weekly update. And we will send those weekly updates until you go in and tick, don't send me a weekly update, and then we'll stop sending them. And what this does is it just gives a little snapshot of what's going on in that course and that course only. It says how many students have visited the course, how many activities there are, what percentage of the activities have been looked at, etc. And we really see this being of use for, all teachers have the courses that they're really interested in, that they are, really sort of engaged with. And it might be, it's their favorite teaching group. It might be it's a group, for instance, of students that may have special needs that I want to be a bit more proactive in terms of monitoring. So I can come in for just that report, just that course, turn this on and get these weekly updates. We don't expect teachers to turn this on for all of their courses. It's something really just to highlight what's going on in the courses. You can turn it on, you can get all of those weekly updates. We've made it simple. You can't pick whether it's every 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 9 weeks, because the more complexity, the less chance of things being used. It's a nice little feature. Turn it on, get a weekly update. If it's a bit annoying, turn it off a bit, turn it back on when you want to. And from the message I get delivered, to my mobile or to my desktop, I can click one link and go in and see those reports and of course turn them off. So it made them easy to turn on and easy to turn off. The last thing that I want to talk about is helping teachers think about this data in a slightly different way. So we've looked a lot at how I can see my students are working and how I can pivot my teaching to help my students. What about me as an educator? I'm creating materials, I'm creating plans, I maybe am creating videos and offline, online materials. I'm engaging with my students, maybe through online lessons, maybe through things like GoToMeeting or Teams or Zoom or things like that. I need to be really sure that the materials I'm creating are being looked at by my students and my students are engaging with them. So we introduced earlier this year something called the resources summary. And what this does is it shows what my students are looking at. Okay, so it doesn't show really, what individual students are doing. It's showing for these bits of materials, these items I put into my course, how are they being engaged with? So it's answering the questions: who's looking at my resources? Are my resources being looked at more than once? How long approximately are people spending looking at my resources? And which resources are they looking at the most? So I can see a list of all of the items I've added into the course, and we follow the structure. So if I've created plans, with different units and things, you'll see the same structure here in the report. I can filter it, for instance, to look at all of the cloud documents I uploaded, or all of the assignments and things like that. So I can choose the type, and then it'll tell me how many students have read them, approximately how long have all of my students spent looking at it, and then when I view details, it'll tell me how many times the students have read the materials and if indeed the students have read them or not. So here I can see approximately how long students have spent with that piece of material, how many times it's been read, and are students revisiting it time after time. And this gives me a really good idea about the efficacy, the value to students of the materials that I'm creating. And you can do this for any of the materials in the course. And for instance, if I have a web link off to another site, the BBC or whatever, that can appear in here as well, and I can see how long students have spent on it. Though I can't see how long they've spent reading it, because we don't track how long students are spending looking at things outside itslearning. It's one of those things that you shouldn't do. We shouldn't be trying to capture data about people's usage of other sites. So that's when I said time online is a useful thing. It is not perfect, but it gives a really good indication of how long people are spending within the platform. Okay, so just on time, that's it in terms of my presentation. I think we'll hand back over to our host. And we'll open it up for questions. And John and I are happy to answer questions on anything to do with data, how it's stored, how it's used, and the efficacy of it. And we'll just be interested to see your feedback on this and any things that you'd like to ask.